Welcome back out on the mushroom trail. If this is your first time joining us, this is a channel where we jump into the forest and see what we can find in the way of fungi. Inevitably, along the way, we're oftentimes bumping into all kinds of interesting little natural phenomena out here, from animals to birds to plenty of foraging opportunities involving the incredible diversity of plants that exists out here in the forests of the Pacific Northwest. So thanks so much for coming along. If you're liking this channel, remember, hit the like button, subscribe, stay tuned. Let's jump in. Let's see what we see. So I'm just off trail right now, kind of exploring an area where it seems like the coyotes really like this spot, so it's always interesting to poke around. Check this out. So down here, we've got little Nolanea. So we see this kind of silky, fibrous stripe. If I look underneath, let's actually go ahead and take a quick peek at this. So we're going to notice a light colored spore showing up on those gills. You may or may not be able to detect that, but it's a light pink spore color. On the cap of this, we've got slight striations. Nolanea Genus is fairly complex. We've got quite a few toxic mushrooms too in that group, so this is generally one that I leave behind, but cool to see out here. If we look just ahead, let's actually buck up over this log and see we've got another Nolanea here. See a similar silky stipe. And then behind this, we've got a different one. This is actually a polypore. This is Picipes tubaeformis. And you'll notice that this is somewhat similar to one that we've featured in previous videos. That was Picipes badius, the black-footed polypore. This one's a little bit different. You'll notice that the underside of it is full of small white pores. This is one that I don't see quite as often out here, but I've been seeing quite a bit of it this spring. Now, I'm not too informed in terms of, many of the details around this one regarding any of its, medicinal capabilities or any kind of unique qualities that this one has. So I'd be curious to learn from you. If this is one that you know a lot about, share your information down in the comments. I'd be really curious to know what you have to say about this one, because this is still very much one that I'm still getting to know. But very cool to see out here. Again, this is Picipes tubaeformis, formerly known as Polyporus tubaeformis. But check this out. So as I was poking around up here, I saw something that I at first thought may be mushroom, but upon closer examination, I realized that it's not. And what it actually is a skull. Check this out. Look at those really developed canines there. See back here, well, we've got a little bit of a little crest here. A lot of times if this is really pronounced, that's kind of a sign of a predator, right? So the jaw muscles will attach there to that crest or ridge. So the lack of a clearly defined sagittal crest combined with the overall dimensions as well as the teeth pattern, right? The dentition helps to positively identify this as a raccoon skull. Definitely not what I was expecting to find today, but super cool to see. Just down from where that raccoon skull was, I was checking out this witch's butter over here. So this is, I think of this as like a winter thing, right? These jelly fungi this is Dacrymyces, chrysospermus, the witch's butter growing on Douglas fir here. So I was just kind of admiring that. And you can see a little bit of a clump over there. We've talked about that in the past. So that's been used in traditional Chinese medicine. And it's also one of those rare mushrooms that's edible raw. A lot of times people will make fruit leathers out of those. But as I was looking at that, this big old white flash over here caught my eye. And super, super interesting. So check this out. As we stroll over here, you can see, just laying like so, prominently displayed here, we've got yet another, what I believe is a coyote skull here. And this one, significantly larger. So if you look at my hand, for scale, this is about the size of my hand, maybe a little bit longer actually than my outstretched hand, about the same size. Here we see that pronounced Sagittarius crest. If I flip this over, we can see some wear to the molars a little bit, but no canines in this one. It looks like they've actually fallen out, but crazy how many coyote experiences I've been having recently out here. What are they trying to tell me? I keep bumping into skulls and actual coyotes, and they're howling at me, doing their thing, yipping, yapping, all that good stuff. I suppose it's an active time of year for them. So super cool to see out here. You never know what you're going to come across, and it's one of the things I love about being out here in the forest. You know, you might set out in search of a specific mushroom, but sometimes you find stuff that's entirely different but equally fascinating. So cool to see out here. Beautiful place to spend the afternoon. So moving just down the trail here, we've got a nice fruiting on this big red alder hanging over the trail here. I can see it from a mile away. Looks like a familiar and welcome sight. This is our old friend, the oyster mushroom. This is in the Pleurotus genus. So we can see this is a very typical flush or fruiting. You can see how it's clustered in mass growing off of the side of hardwood, in this case, red alder. If I zoom in and we take a look underneath, so if you're new to oyster mushrooms, this is really distinct. Notice these gills running down the stipe. We call or refer to that as being decurrent. So they run all the way down from the outside of the cap out here, all the way down the stem or the stipe of this down here. So very cool to see. If we give this a whiff, we'll catch a nice kind of fungal anise flavor. And notice that the actual cap itself is sort of white, perhaps in an off brown color. And these, as referenced in past videos, are, as many of you I'm sure know, a very kind of sought after edible mushroom. They're also medicinal, so these have a lot of health benefits just consuming these, and they're also quite high in protein. So we've mentioned in the past that these are one of our carnivorous fungi that will actually attract nematodes and consume those as a nitrogen source. Another function or use for this that's worth noting is that, you know, a lot of times after these wildfire burns, specifically, you know, in years past in California, there were several projects where people were going in and using the native Pleurotus or oyster mushroom as a way of kind of mopping up the area. These are really, really good at both kind of filtering the environment for, you know, things like heavy metals, but also petrochemicals. So anytime that, like, say a house or homestead is burnt, that's full of a lot of toxic kind of chemicals and different things that through that fire find their way into the environment. So these are oftentimes used for that mycoremediation, to actually kind of filter out those petrochemicals and really kind of clean things up when we've got some toxic chemicals in the area. So interesting to note, and also a good reason with a lot of mushrooms in general that tend to bioaccumulate different heavy metals or different things like that. It's good to kind of keep an eye on where you're harvesting these things from and just to be mindful of that. So out here, we're in the middle of the forest. I feel great about harvesting this. So I'm going to harvest some of these, bring them back home. They'll make a nice addition to whatever we're having for dinner tonight. And keep my eye out and see if we spot any more a little later in the day. But cool to see. That's the oyster mushroom, Pleurotus genus. Boy, and here's another angle on this fruiting of these oysters. Just look at this. Really incredible fruiting. Something about that site that just always makes me happy seeing a flush like this. Really amazing. Just keeps on going too, higher than I can reach, that's for sure. So cool to see. And moving just up the trail here, I see something that's becoming a weekly appearance here on the mushroom trail. Look at this. Boy, just a beautiful, beautiful example of the spring orange peel fungus. This is Caloscypha fulgens. And again, you know, this one, not edible. One of the distinguishing features on this is that it's got this blue-green type appearance here on the outside of the cup. Again, you know, as referenced before, there is one that looks kind of similar to this that I could see people going after. It's just called or referred to as the orange peel fungus. That one is edible, but this one reportedly toxic. But boy, sure beautiful to look at. I'm seeing this all over the place on the side of the trails right now, just in and amongst the mosses. So very cool to see, a real beauty in all its splendor here in the sunshine. That's the spring orange peel fungus, Caloscypha fulgens. So I'm just off trail here, and even though I typically find my best fruitings of turkey tail in the fall, it's not uncommon for me to encounter nice fresh fruitings here in the springtime. And we can see down here, so this is a good example of that. We've got a nice kind of smooth felty haired surface. We can see banded colors, right? So we've got banded colors. If I zoom in there, you can see that felty little surface. If you can feel that, it would feel kind of like a soft, velvety texture. If I take this and I peel off just a little bit of this to give you a look underneath, you're going to notice these fine white pores. And you can really see that. Now, a lot of the turkey tail lookalikes that are out here, which include the violet-toothed polypore, which is Trichaptum genus, and the false turkey tail, Trillium, both of those will have different undersides, right? So the Trillium will be smooth, buff orange surface, and the violet-toothed polypore will look a little coarse, but it'll also have oftentimes a little bit of violet around the edges. Looks very different than this finely pored white surface. So this, of course, the most studied medicinal mushroom on the planet. I actually, you know, this time of year, kind of, you know, fall, winter, early spring, I typically consume this pretty often. And so I've actually been going through a lot of my current supply, and I've been running a little bit low. So I might actually take advantage of this opportunity and just harvest just a small amount of this. I'll probably leave the bulk of it, but I can see this growing from hardwood. Likely, I'm thinking this is probably big leaf maple. It's a little old, so it's hard to tell for sure. But yeah, looking up, we were right underneath a huge big leaf maple. So I tend to find my best fruitings on that or older out here. So even though it's springtime, a lot of people aren't looking for turkey tail necessarily. It's definitely out there. So keep your eyes peeled. And again, if you see the underside surface and it's not this vibrant white, you know, sometimes when it's old, it'll get a little brown or kind of off colored. And if that's the case, I'll usually pass on it and wait for something that looks more similar to what we're seeing here. So Very cool to see. Turkey tail, Trametes versicolor. Kind of cool, middle of the day here. We got a barred owl yelling at us. Let's see if he'll do his thing. So less than 24 hours ago, I was out on this exact same trail, out on a trail run, and I spotted something that caught my eye, something that I love seeing each time I'm out here on the trail. And this was not a mushroom per se, but something that I oftentimes see when I'm out in the field looking for mushrooms. Now it's worth noting that when I spotted this less than 24 hours ago, it looked quite a bit different than this. So it actually looked like shiny little white beads of tapioca, which is how this one gets its common name. This is what's referred to as the tapioca slime mold, Brefeldia maxima. And boy, you can see it in its later growth here, where it's totally changed color and is sporing out, or in the process of sporing out. So those of you who've been watching the videos for some time may recall seeing a prime example of this on an older video that was on winter foraging. And these Myxomycetes, these true slime molds, are such fascinating little beings. So just to walk you through kind of a quick life cycle of a slime mold, these essentially exist in 3 different phases of life. So the first phase is actually as a single-celled amoeba-like organism that's actually a haploid cell. And by haploid, we mean that it contains half of the genetic material, just like sex cells and other kind of living beings. And they're actually going to congregate together as a community. And at this point in time, they remain technically single-celled organisms, but they'll actually have many nuclei. And at this stage, they become diploid cells, and that kind of brings about this fruiting stage. So this is actually referred to as a sporangia, and this is essentially their spore-producing body. So this is similar to, say, like a mushroom fruiting, or, you know, a fungi, a type of fungi fruiting out and creating a mushroom, right? That's its spore-bearing surface, right? The way that it reproduces and spreads and repopulates. So that same thing is happening here. And this, like I said, these can take on some crazy looks, you know? So anyone who spent time out in the forest searching for fungi has surely encountered a hefty number of plasmoidal slime molds. And boy, they can just be so interesting. And at this stage, right, you can almost see some of those spores associated with this guy. And it's interesting that this little insect is here, this little ant, because I've heard that with this particular one, the insects play a crucial role in spreading these spores. So interesting to think that, you know, this plays a crucial role in forest ecology, and it's tough to know exactly what all it's doing. This is not type of organism that's been extensively studied in that ecological role. And even though there's a lot that we know about it, there's a lot that we don't know. So super interesting. You might also recall in recent videos, I talked about the wolf's milk, which was a cool one. That was another plasmoidal slime mold that had a pinkish, orangish, kind of salmon-y looking fruit body that you could actually pop, and it had a liquid pigment. It's interesting, a lot of these are being researched or studied. I hear with wolf's milk in particular, it's used both in cosmetics and as a source of, you know, looking for bioactive compounds that could be used in different medicinal capacities as antibiotics and other forms of medicine. So a lot that we know about these plasmoidal slime molds, but probably more that we don't know. So such cool little beings. If you haven't paused to take time to get to know these things, I'd encourage you to do so, because they have such interesting little personalities. I always love seeing them out here on the forest floor. And usually at this sporangia stage, right, the fruiting stage, I usually see them on wood and woody material, just like we're seeing here. And something else just catching my eye just down the trail here. You'll recognize a familiar sight, an old friend here. So this is, of course, the oyster mushroom, Pleurotus genus. We can see this is not a particularly fresh cluster here. So you can see it's looking a little bit dried out, right? But just kind of a recap, we see that strongly decurrent gills running down to the base. This is, of course, on hardwood. These are red alder logs, so quite a fruiting. These guys are really out right now. If they've been out for a while and they're starting to get to this dried out phase, I'll tend to pass on them. They can be buggy even when fresh, but especially at this stage. So I also just harvested several that looked quite a bit better. So not in a hurry to necessarily jump on these, but I'll still give you a look so that you can kind of see what we're getting into here. You can see an even bigger cluster all down this log. We can see clear down there. So no shortage of oysters. And in fact, as I look up in the distance, just going up this huckleberry bush and beyond to what's behind that, you see quite a fruiting of oyster mushrooms all up this red alder snag. So those are really out right now. The Pleurotus genus, we've talked about those at length in the past, so I won't bore you with the details, but super cool to see out here. Always so much going on. So all up and down this trail, I see a beautiful white flower blooming out, and we can just see there's just heaps of it all up and down this trail. This is one of my favorite springtime flowers. This is what's known as the Pacific or Western Trillium, Trillium ovatum. And that genus name, Trillium, refers to in threes. So you'll notice that this plant has 3 leaves, 3 big leaves, 3 flower petals, 3 sepals, and also 3 stigmas in the center there. So this is just a beautiful perennial flower that is really special to me. When I was growing up in the Midwest, I grew up in the state of Ohio primarily, and for much of my younger years, right out my back door was a white oak kind of swamp forest that had quite a few trilliums. Now, this being back east was a different species of trillium than this, but very closely related, very similar looking. And what I was told at a really young age is that, hey, if you pull up that flower, it will not grow back. And, you know, that made me really take a deep look at this one and understand its life cycle a little more than I perhaps otherwise would have. And I always regarded it as just this really special springtime flower that anytime I saw it, I stopped and admired and just showed it a little bit of respect. Now this one, so, you know, I've read that from seed, it can take, you know, 7 to 10 years for this thing to produce this initial flower. Once it starts to do this, this thing can persist year after year. I've heard that this specific species, Trillium ovatum, can live over 70 years, which is really something. And you know, I've oftentimes encountered this one in old growth forests and just seen massive leaves and flowers. And I haven't been able to look at that and know for sure how old it is, but some of these plants can get really well established and produce huge flowers. And I have to think they've been there for a long time. And I wonder how much of, you know, life in this forest they've observed over the past several decades. So cool to see out here. Now you'll notice on this one, it starts as this really stunning white flower. But if we look a little further down the trail, you'll notice this same plant can take on a bit of a different look. So usually that white flower will persist for maybe perhaps a few weeks, but as it gets a little older, it's going to start to get a little bit of a pink color, right? So sometimes it will be a very light pink, or it'll just start to pinken up. And then as it's been out longer, that color will deepen to the point where sometimes you'll see an almost burgundy color. Now, just a second ago, we were talking about those slime molds, and we were talking about the potential role that insects play in dispersing spores. And that's true for a lot of mushrooms too. One thing that's really cool about this plant is that the seeds on it that it'll develop will have a little oil-rich kind of appendage that holds the seed in place. And this is really attractant to ants. So what's cool about that is that oftentimes ants will seek out this plant and they'll be drawn to that appendage that's on the seed. So they'll oftentimes take it back to their nest, feed it to larvae, and then cast aside the leftovers, aka the seed, in its little kind of rubbish pile. And so kind of interesting to think. Now, this particular species, I will note, that's not necessarily the primary means of seed dispersal, but it's cool nonetheless. And if we really start to look around here, in fact, right here, so just underneath the Pacific Trillium, we've got one of my favorite spring flowers that's a little bit different. So you'll notice this really distinct kind of vibrant green leaf structure. If we scroll up, this here is what's known as the bleeding heart, Dicentra formosa. In this one, its primary method of seed dispersal does involve ants as well. So just like the Trillium, this will eventually produce like, you know, a seed-bearing structure that'll be like a little pod type structure. And that'll produce these small little pebbly black seeds that also have an appendage, a white appendage, that contains, it's very oil rich, and that's a huge attractant to the ants. So the ants will seek out this plant for sure, and they'll take it back and disperse the seed in that way. So I always just marvel at just kind of how interconnected all these living species are out here in the forest, how everything fits together. You know, sometimes, I would say most often, we may not be aware of all the different associations and strategies that all of these plants and fungi and trees and animals, we're not always clued in to the interplay between all these. But boy, when we really start to pause and marvel at the way all these things fit together so perfectly out here in nature, it never ceases to amaze me. Now, really quickly, so the Trillium, this Trillium ovatum does have some edible and medicinal qualities, but because of the simple fact that I think I've held such reverence for this for so long, and I know, you know, how long this can kind of persist and live, I tend to not use this in any kind of utilitarian sense other than just admiring it as a more or less a beautiful piece of art out here in nature. Same thing goes for this one. So the bleeding heart is actually toxic to some degree. It does contain really powerful alkaloids that have been used in different medicinal preparations. It has historic use for sure amongst the Aboriginal people here and others. But again, this one, not one that I typically use, and again, can be toxic in different capacities. So probably best just admired out here on the forest floor. But so cool to see. I'm always out here looking for fungi, but also keeping my eyes peeled for just all these beautiful plants and flowers and different things that are so abundant this time of year out here. So super cool to see. And what a beauty. Trillium ovatum. Keep your eyes peeled for this one next time you're out in the forest. And just up the trail here, aside from yet another abundance here of the Trillium that we referenced, I also see a nice abundant smattering of another beautiful spring flower. If we look here, so this is quite a bit smaller than the Trillium. We see a nice, beautiful 5-petaled flower that's got, you know, these flowers are white overall, but it's got this little colorful pinkish, reddish candy stripe. This is what's commonly referred to as Siberian miner's lettuce. It also goes by the common name candy flower. This is Claytonia siberica. This is a really interesting plant. So it gets its most frequently used common name, Siberian miner's lettuce, from this idea that miners during the mid-1800s California gold rush would oftentimes seek this out and consume it as a source of vitamin C to avoid scurvy and other kind of ailments that might get them while out in the wild. So with that said, this plant is oftentimes consumed as, an edible green. So all of the part above the ground is oftentimes thrown into salads and whatnot these days. Now, it's important to reference though. So this plant does contain oxalic acid, which is not a huge concern or anything, right? A lot of the greens that we consume typically are similar in containing oxalic acid. So the primary ones that come to mind that are high in oxalic acid are things like spinach, Swiss chard, also beet greens. These are all things that are best consumed not in abundance, right? So you don't want to overdo it, especially with the raw greens of any of these. Now, also worth noting that there's another type of common miner's lettuce. So same genus, Claytonia, but this one is Claytonia perfoliata. And this one, it kind of has leaves that look like lily pads and small white flowers. So again, definitely related, goes by the same common name. That one's lower in oxalic acid and tends to make a little bit of a better green. These can be a little bit bitter, especially in age, as is the case with most edible greens. A lot of times if you get them before they flower, they're gonna be a little bit, just kind of a little bit of a better edible. Sometimes they can get a little bitter with that flowering process as the chemistry changes a little bit. So something that's just worth noting here. But again, you can certainly consume this. I wouldn't recommend overdoing it, but you can certainly consume it as an edible green, add it to salads, do different things like that. It's also worth noting that historically, so we referenced the idea that miners and pioneers would oftentimes consume this, but from my research, a lot of the indigenous populations, the native peoples of this area, rarely took this as, food. So this was more something that was used medicinally, especially externally. And I think that there were other things around childbirth and labor that this functioned as. So it wasn't, to my knowledge, widely regarded as a great spring edible, but it was something that, all of that said, it's high in vitamin C, and it is an edible green. So definitely cool to see out here. What I'd love to do, let's venture a little further up trail. I'm kind of keeping my eyes peeled for one of my favorite edible greens that I know is going to pop up along the side of the trail that oftentimes comes up near Siberian miner's lettuce. Let's venture up the trail and see if we can find that one. And sure enough, just across the trail, we've got more Trillium, we've got some beautiful ferns fruiting out, we've got that miner's lettuce, some salmonberry, but also we've got the exact spring green that I was hoping to find. So this, let's take a look. Let's zoom in here and take a look. It's not as eye-catching as the flower of either the Trillium or the miner's lettuce, and it's quite a bit smaller. So see if you can see this little tiny white flower. This is a plant that's common around the country, and really it's pretty well distributed around the world. A lot of times this is often regarded as a weed, but boy, this is one of my all-time favorite spring edible herbs or salad greens. This is what's commonly referred to as chickweed, Stellaria media. And if you look at this, let me see if I can zoom in here. You notice these very small, unsuspecting little white flowers. So, if you were to just kind of zoom in and count these flower petals, you would probably come to the conclusion that it has 10 small little flower petals. In fact, it actually is similar to the Siberian miner's lettuce in the simple fact that that flower has 5 petals, but they're really deeply cleft or split down the middle. So it's actually a 5-petaled flower. You also might notice as you look at this that it's got tiny little hairs, and those hairs are growing off of the stalk or stem. They're also coming off of the petioles which it's worth noting that these leaves have little petioles. That's like kind of the technical term that we use to describe the stem of the leaves. Whereas, you know, just a second ago when we were looking at this Siberian miner's lettuce, if I pan over here, notice how this is a much different leaf structure. So you'll see that these leaves grow flush with the stem. So that's very, very different. We call those sessile leaves when they grow straight from the stem and kind of lack the leaf stem coming from that central stalk. So very interesting to see. Now this chickweed, this is, like I said, one of my absolute favorite spring herbs or edible greens. This is something that I add to salads all the time. You can make pestos out of it. This is also similar to the Siberian miner's lettuce. It's very high in vitamin C, so it's very nutritive. Also from an herbal perspective, it's used for calming, right? So this is anti-inflammatory. Has a cooling, calming, soothing property to it. And it's very, it does have a little bit of a fibrous nature, especially if it's gone a while, but it's a very good one to know. Now, I want to kind of zoom in here real quick to get this ID down, because this could be confused depending on what part of the country you're in. It could be confused with different plants that are toxic. So let's zoom in, let's take a look. Okay, so let's take a closer look at this one. So from this angle, you can see really clearly these little flower petals. And again, we said that there's 5 of them. Even though it looks like there's 10, they're just deeply cleft or cut down the center. So that's a very interesting feature of this. But if we look at the key characteristics that we want to kind of clue into to positively ID this in the field, here's what we're going to be looking for. So the first thing is that we know that there's these leaf stems, which again, the fancy term for that, petioles. That's one important thing to check off of our list. Now after that, we want to kind of look closely at these stems. And so what you're going to notice is that all the way up the stem and also up the petioles, you're going to see fine little hairs. So you can see those off to the right. Now here's an interesting thing about this, is where these leaves attach to the stem, we call these nodes. So when it hits one of these nodes, the hairs will actually turn 90 degrees. So, and it's very difficult to see without really taking a close look or even using a magnifying glass. But you can see those hairs going clear up those petioles. And then oftentimes, if you're able to get a really good view of these stems, you're going to notice that we've got hairs here. And then when it switches beyond that next node, the hairs are going to be 90 degrees from there. So not in the same location. So you can see that those are different. You can see them on the left side now, and then you have to actually turn it a little bit to see it on the right side. So that's another key distinguishing feature, but there's one that really stands out with this one that's unique. And if I just kind of pinch this subtly, and what I'm going to do is gently pull this apart, notice what we've got in the middle. This is this really thin little elastic cord that runs up the center of this stem. This is not the only plant out there that contains this, but if you're comparing it to toxic lookalikes, this is the only one that I know of that has this, that looks and has all these same features as chickweed. So this is very cool. Next time that you see this, I'd encourage you to try to test this with that little kind of elastic rubbery cord that runs up that stem of the plant. So very cool to see. Also worth noting that you can see on those sepals or little flower buds, you can also see those fine little hairs. So I'm going to go ahead and harvest a bunch of this. Like I said, this is one of my all-time favorite spring greens. I'm going to go ahead and harvest some, bring it home to the table. This will go great with tonight's dinner salad. So cool to see. Keep your eyes peeled out here. You never know what you're going to find. A lot of times I go out looking for mushrooms and I come home with plants. So always exciting to see what foraging opportunities are available out here in the forest. So moving just up the trail here, It is wild how many of these spring plants are just in full bloom right now. We've got our Siberian miner's lettuce, we've got our chickweed, we've got all kinds of cool spring plants coming out. And this is one that I'm sure several of you here in the Pacific Northwest recognize. So notice this red, hairy stalk and stems. This is a plant that's oftentimes regarded as a noxious invasive weed here in the Pacific Northwest. But if you're viewing this out in Europe, I'm sure you recognize this as well. This is commonly referred to as herb Robert, Geranium robertianum. And this is kind of an interesting one because, you know, it doesn't have history here as being a native plant, but I know it's got a very long history of use in Europe. So, this one in particular has a really unique fragrance or aroma due to the chemical compounds that are contained within this plant. We oftentimes would refer to this as Stinky Bob while working with young people. I oftentimes would be teaching different kind of naturalist and survival skills to young people. And this one we would frequently use as an insecticide or a mosquito repellent. And it seemed to be fairly effective at that. I know that this also has antibacterial and anti-inflammatory properties. So it also has a use as, a salve, poultice, different things like that. Now, I don't have any experience using this internally, so I can't really speak from direct experience on this, but I know that it's strongly astringent. And I've heard that it's oftentimes, you can't overdo it with this one because it is so astringent that you don't want to mix it with things like, say, calendula or rosemary, other astringent herbs. But an interesting one that I know has long been utilized throughout Europe. Over here we can see a really good example of that. So we've got these really dark, kind of red stems, and we can see just how hairy those are, so soft to the touch. Same thing with the leaves. So we've got a really distinct or unique leaf pattern, and these are hairy underneath as well. So they've got a really soft feel to that touch. And this hasn't started to flower yet, but it will very soon. So we'll check back on this at a later point in time, just to kind of key into the distinguishing features and what this thing looks like while it's flowering. But super interesting plant that I just figured I would point out. So moving right down the trail too, boy, I see one up here that's catching my eye that is my all-time favorite spring edible plant. This one, I know you're no stranger to if you've been watching the videos a while. I oftentimes reference this one, even when we're out looking for mushrooms. This one, I always have to stop to admire, harvest, and utilize. This is the stinging nettle, Urtica dioica. And this is just such an incredible plant. We can see here, it looks like someone's actually harvested the top of this, or perhaps it's been consumed by a deer or something like that. But you'll notice these strongly serrated leaves, opposite leaf pattern, and most distinctively, and the way that most of these people who know this plant know it from the sting, right? So this one can pack a punch. We can see, as I kind of pan up here, those little hairs that run up and down the stalk. Now, the top of the leaves lack those hairs, but if we turn and we look underneath, we get a good angle on that, you'll notice all these tiny little stinging hairs underneath the leaves as well. So those act as sort of like little syringes. So they'll actually, break through our skin, whether it's our hand, arm, leg, any part of our body really that brushes up against this. Those will act like little syringes or needles that'll break through the skin. And when that needle breaks, it releases a formic acid that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It's not a great feeling, although I've heard there are benefits to the sting of the stinging nettle. So if you're a glutton for punishment, or you just like being stung, have at it. Run through fields of this. Let me know how that goes. It's worth noting that some people, when they harvest this one, they will wear gloves or something if they're not gluttons for punishment or don't appreciate that sting. A fancy trick that you'll see some people do, because these stinging hairs are not on the outside, you can actually fold this leaf up and kind of crush it. Its own juices will neutralize the sting as well as your saliva. So you can eat it raw. Fun little trick to impress your friends. Also, you know, my favorite use of this, so, you know, as referenced in videos past, this can be consumed much like any spring green or spinach or anything like that. So you can steam this, you can make a nettle pesto, you can do a lot of things with it. This is incredibly nutritive. So it's high in protein and amino acids, iron, potassium, all kinds of good kind of trace mineral content, and just incredibly healthful herb or plant out here. My favorite use for it though, rather than a steamed green, is to make an infusion. So, which is essentially just a fancy word for a really strong tea. So I'll fill a mason jar with this, I'll pour water over the mason jar, boiling water, and I'll let it sit, typically for 8 hours. And then I'll strain that out, squeeze the juice out of the mark, which is what we refer to as the kind of leftover vegetative material. And then I'll consume that. And that's really high in chlorophyll, amino acids, protein, and all kinds of good stuff, including iron, potassium, calcium, all kinds of things that do the body good. So always love seeing this one. And you know, it's worth noting that, you know, all of these, I try to harvest this before it flowers, because once it goes to flower or you start to see signs of it going to seed, it's not going to be quite as useful or quite as good. So now is a really good time to be harvesting this, and I'll often harvest this in abundance and store it and consume it straight through the winter. One of my really good friends, who's a well-known herbalist, consumes nettle infusion daily. So this is kind of his daily tonic. It's his go-to, and it's treated him really well over the years. One other thing that I'll throw out there about this plant, so it's kind of, you know, not only is it a super green or super food out here that's highly beneficial for us to consume, but also, if you're into bushcraft or survival skills, this is kind of like the everything plant. So notice this one is much more well established. It's got some height to it. So I would oftentimes, I spent a lot of time and years ago, studying and learning and teaching about different survival skills. And one of the things that's at the top of the list when it comes to kind of that field of knowledge is friction fire. And the most common method that we would use for friction fire was what's referred to as a bow drill fire method. And this plant would be crucial in a fire or in a situation where you're trying to create that friction fire. Because this plant, if we look at the stalk here, the fibers that are contained within the stalk of this plant are some of the strongest plant fibers that you'll find out here. Strong enough that we could use it for the bow in that bow drill fire to really crank on to get a flame. Whereas a lot of other plant fibers that are natural plant fibers that you might find out here are not going to have nearly the strength. So we would use that in that scenario. We'd also put it to use in other capacities as well. So it could be used for fishing line or snares or cordage of any sort. There's a specific technique or method that we'd use called reverse wrap cordage. So kind of an interesting one, and again, very important one to know. To get those fibers out of that stalk, we would actually dry it out and then pound it and get those long fibrous strands that we would then weave into cordage. So if that's something that interests you, let me know in the comments. I'd be more than happy to throw information up there on some of those different skill sets that might not oftentimes get exposed to. So cool plant though. Stinging nettle, Urtica dioica. So just up here on the side of the trail, got a very common mushroom that we've certainly been seeing a lot of this spring. Several of you, I'm sure, recognize this. This is what's commonly referred to as the Mica Cap, Coprinellus micaceus. We can see it kind of fruiting up all throughout the duff here. Oftentimes see this at the base of big leaf maple and red alder. If we take a look underneath, we've got a flimsy stipe, and notice underneath we've got these really dark gills. So this is one of the inky caps. Given enough time, this will kind of liquefy and turn into a black, kind of inky goo of sorts. At a young age, this is actually an edible mushroom that's sometimes sought out. It's not one that's on my list. I tend to avoid this one, but some people really like it. I'd be curious, actually, if you're someone who consumes this on a regular basis, let me know. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on it. It's one that I see quite often, but for whatever reason, I rarely harvest this. And it's oftentimes one of those ones that's, you know, when I spot it, it's a little too far gone to consider. When it's fresh, it'll be kind of whitish underneath. You can see that here in this one, actually. So this is a little bit fresher. But they don't last long, you know, like, so these can kind of change in just a matter of days. On this, you can see these little specks on here. This is how this gets its name. They're kind of mica looking little flecks on the cap. So cool to see one of the inky caps out here. Definitely growing in abundance here on the forest floor. Cool to see. And these beautiful little poor man gumdrops, also known as the alpine jellycone, Quipiniopsis alpina, still everywhere. And even though edible raw, these ones are definitely not tempting. You can see they've been out for quite a while, but boy, still beautiful to look at. And moving just up the trail here, I see a really cool sight. Tucked back just off the trail here. Take a look at this. So this is an awesome sight. We see not just one, but two, perhaps more. If we look a little more closely here, we'll see what we find. This is a really cool spring mushroom. This one we've talked about in videos past. Yeah, we can see another one hiding back there. This is one of our favorite spring boletes to find. So this is what's known as the deep purple bolete, Xerocamelus atropurpureus. Now, not too long ago, I would have referred to this as the Zeller's bolete, Xerocamelus zelleri, which is another very common, kind of similar looking bolete that's actually somewhat difficult to differentiate, you know. It's only really DNA sequencing and analysis that has really kind of separated those, because they have a lot of common or similar features. But as we look at this one, we notice that it's got this rough, kind of bumpy cap. So you can see the texture on that. You can also see, if you look at it from the correct angle, that it's got kind of an almost purplish hue. Now, along those edges, you can see the color of that porous, kind of spore-producing sponge underneath. Let me go ahead, let's cut this and take a look. All right, so if we pull this guy up and we take a look underneath, here's what we've got underneath. And you can see this little one next to it. Boy, you can really see that purple hue just kind of coming up from the side of the cap. We see that margin's a little lighter. The Zeller's bolete will have an even more pronounced outer margin. But take a look at this. So notice that this is not a gilled mushroom, but a pored mushroom. And if we zoom in and we take a look at that, we can see that this sponge layer is sort of a yellowish color. So yellow in appearance. If I take this and I peel this back, let's see what this looks like here. So this is very typical of boletes in general. We've got a little bit of rain coming down, so it's making this a little mushier than it may otherwise be. But you can see that really unique kind of gilled structure. You can see the side kind of profile there, and then the fleshed underneath there. So this is the spore-bearing surface of this one. As we look around or zoom out, boy, I'm seeing plenty of these jumping out. You can see this particular one is especially large. You can see a little bit of cracking here on the cap, somewhat similar to another of the suede boletes, Xerocamelus diffractus. That's the red cracking bolete. This is not that one. This is, again, the deep purple bolete. But it's interesting to see this little cracking feature. So clearly this has probably been out a little while. Prior to getting this little dose of rain, it had been quite dry. As I pan over here too, I see a really nice young looking deep purple bolete back there. This has a little bit of a lemony taste to it. And this is not the season that we typically think of as finding great boletes, such as the king bolete. We do have the spring king that'll be popping up relatively soon, but for this time of year currently, it's a pretty darn good edible mushroom. So I may go ahead and harvest a few of these and take them home, cook them up. Cool to see. And one other really quick feature or detail that I just wanted to point out really quickly is that you'll notice this one I went ahead and sliced it. So you can see little pieces here off to the side. So you can see that this is fairly meaty. And one of the things that's, you know, also something to be on the lookout for is several of these different boletes will have a bluing feature, right? So when you cut into them, they'll sometimes blue or have a slight bluish bruising, even sometimes on this pore surface. That's not happening on this, which tends to be a good sign. There are instances where I've seen this one display or exhibit some slight bluing, but usually that's very minor, if at all. And in my experience, a lot of the ones that do tend to bruise blue in the boletes tend to not be quite as good eating. There are some exceptions to that rule, but in general, if you see blue bruising, may not be as choice as some of these other ones. So just wanted to point that out really quickly before we move on to the next thing. So I've just gone ahead and harvested a bunch of these, and one other thing that I wanted to note is that, you know, for these young ones, say like this one, very small mushroom, we can see that that pore structure underneath isn't too well established, so I'm gonna leave that one on there. But on something like this that's a little bit more developed, I'll tend to take these off. They can get a little bit mushy when you're cooking them. They can be a little bit strange. It is true that they do add a little bit of flavor to this particular mushroom, so that's the reason why I will keep it on the younger ones. But in general, I'll tend to remove this before I cook it. So I just wanted to mention that real quick, and that's something that's standard for a lot of the boletes, is to remove that particular part of them prior to cooking. So just figured I'd demonstrate that so that you all have an idea. If you are finding these out, you can make a call. Not everyone does it the same way, so if you have a differing opinion on that, just let me know. So that's a beautiful look at our deep purple bolete, Xerocamelus atropurpureus. Notice we've got that bumpy, textured, kind of purplish cap, definitely dark in color. The stipe or stem, a little bit reddish in color. We can see those other kind of light colors around the margin. And then, as noted before, this yellow porous structure underneath in place of gills. So that's the spore-producing surface that's going to be yellow. And you can see a little bit of bruising blue, just very slightly, on that one that was cut. So you can see it's not super pronounced. On some of those, we'll see like a very deep blue on some of the other boletes. This one has a subtle amount of that, but again, took a while to show up, and even when it did, not super pronounced. And all along the trail here, I love seeing this guy. Beautiful spring sight. I'm sure several of you watching recognize this. If you're local here in the Pacific Northwest, this is the flower of the salmonberry. So whenever I see this start to bloom, I get excited because not only is it a good trailside little snack that's high in vitamin C, you can actually eat those flowers as well as the shoots. So that historically, a lot of the tribes in the area would actually consume not just the actual salmon berries, but also the spring shoots, which would be a really kind of succulent, nice little spring edible. But these flowers as well, these call in the Rufous Hummingbird. So each year those birds migrate up here all the way from Mexico. They'll come up to Western Washington and throughout the Pacific Northwest and beyond. And this is one of the flowers that they really gravitate towards. So that's kind of cool. That's the salmonberry flower in particular, along with the red flowering currant, those are both two of our earliest spring flowering plants out here that are of a nature that the hummingbird really appreciates. So super interesting. You know, the male will actually come up a few weeks before the females, and those are the first signs. That's typically in March. And at this point in time, you know, I'm hearing songs of the Rufous Hummingbird pretty regularly, and we've got both the males and the females up here. And even though it's raining a little bit, I see a bee also gravitating to this particular plant. So very cool to see out here. Very common spring sight that we'll continue to admire all through the summer. And not too far from now, you know, this is going to start kicking out berries, and around that time we'll start to hear the song of the Swainson's thrush. So definitely a beautiful one. Keep your eyes peeled. Fun to see. Boy, and it's hard not to get distracted by all these beautiful spring flowers that we're seeing. Off to the side here, as we look up the trail, you'll notice this really distinct yellow flower coming from a plant that is very common out here in the forest floor. This is the Oregon grape. And if we look at these flowers, these are actually another one of my favorite trailside snacks this time of year. They've got a really kind of tangy, sour flavor. It's quite tasty. If you haven't tried these, give them a whirl. See what you think. Awesome plant though. Certainly we'll talk about this one more at a future date, but awesome to see out here. And hiding just off the trail here, see a little familiar sight back in here. It's a good example of the turkey tail, Trametes versicolor. We see that white outer margin, banded color, little felty cap, and I guarantee that if we were to peek underneath the surface, we'd see a finely white poured surface. Cool to see. This one a little lighter in color than the one that we harvested earlier, but this guy is certainly showing up all over the place. Right here in front of us, we've got the Indian plum, also known as the oso berry. This is the first one to kind of bud out in spring. It's well on its way at this stage in the game, but a really cool plant that you may remember from prior videos has a kind of cascading or hanging white flower. These leaves will actually taste a little bit like cucumber rind. So they kind of make a really interesting addition to like a salad or a sandwich. Just nibbling on them. Boy, it's such a distinct cucumber flavor. Really interesting. Cool one to note. This is always one of my favorite sights come springtime. As these leaves start to mature and get bigger, we're kind of far along on this particular plant right now. That cucumber rind flavor can get a little bit bitter, but you'll still be able to recognize that distinct flavor in the leaf. So interesting to see. And boy, it has been a fantastic spring day out here. I can't help but get excited with this rainfall, rising temperatures, all that good stuff. Forest is really coming alive out here. So excited to see what the next few weeks may bring. And really appreciate you tuning in and joining me out here on the mushroom trail. If you're enjoying these videos, remember, hit the like button, subscribe, stay tuned. All that really helps the channel grow and motivates me to continue to get out here and continue to get these videos out your way. So really appreciate all of you. If something in these videos catches your interest, leave a comment. Let me know your thoughts. I'm always curious to know what you're seeing as well out in your neck of the woods. So keep me posted on what you all are seeing. And in the meantime, until next time, happy trails.